voters' minds.
Joy Reid, same question.
Yeah, there were a lot of them up there. But I mean, I guess the good news is there are two lanes here, right? There is the...
Boy, did we see that.
Right? There's sort of the hope and a future lane. And tomorrow we're going to have more of those candidates who are going to be on stage. There are three lanes. The second one is obviously the clear progressive lane, which Warren and Sanders share. I was surprised they didn't try to narrow that down. They did seem, as Chris said, to be kind of on the same team, fighting off all the moderates to their left and to their right on that stage. But among the moderates, the job was to then narrow it down and become the moderate, because right now Joe Biden occupies that lane of being the moderate, and the only alternative to him is going to be a governor or maybe Mayor Pete Buttigieg. So I was looking to see if one of them was going to stand out as the one guy who could be the last moderate standing. I'm not sure that any of them stood out for me in a sense that they were going to be able to eliminate the others. They're all at 0%. I thought Buttigieg did a good job of laying claim to being the moderate who's also young, so that he could be a moderate that's also marketable maybe to a party that wants a future sort of candidate but still wants a moderate and somebody who's going to scare them. I do think that Delaney did a good job of trying to be the pugilist to take down Warren and Sanders. I was surprised that Warren and Sanders didn't try to differentiate between themselves. So I think, because she was the person who was sort of the front runner, on paper first, I think it's a good night for Warren. No one took her down.
Lawrence O'Donnell, fellow Bay Stater.
Strongly agree with that last line, that it really was Elizabeth Warren's debate going in, and it stayed that way all the way through. I didn't see anybody gain on her at any point in it. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, I don't think so much they made a tactical decision not to argue with each other. There's nothing to argue about. So it would look very strange if one of them tried to find a sliver of space between them. I think there might be three categories there: the moderates, the liberals, and Pete Buttigieg, who I think wants to sound like a moderate in some moments and wants not to in other moments. And I think chooses those very carefully. So I think he actually lives in between those two spaces. Of the people clearly occupying the moderate side of the stage, I actually thought Tim Ryan had the best night by far. I thought he never had a misstep. You can disagree with his policies, but he was very clear in stating them. He's from Ohio, which we must never forget, and he doesn't let you forget that.
Given us 8 presidents.
Yeah, and the other one who's kind of near that category is Beto O'Rourke, who, because he's from Texas, does not embrace all of the liberal positions. He stressed those 38 electoral votes in Texas because there's a new poll out today showing Beto O'Rourke beats Donald Trump by double digits in Texas. Beto O'Rourke is by far the strongest Democratic candidate there, and he was trying to demonstrate that. But at the top of the game tonight, Elizabeth Warren seemed to hold her position and had, I think, some very, very strong moments in going back against candidates like Delaney and Governor Bullock, especially on the nuclear first strike question. Elizabeth Warren had a real presidential posture in the way she expressed herself about that. The governor started to stumble in his struggle with her over should we have a policy of announcing that the United States will never use nuclear weapons as a first strike. Elizabeth Warren said, yes, we should have that policy. The governor tried to argue about that, and it looks like she really, I felt she dominated that section really strongly.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.